Today we are going to be writing up the post lab for the lab that we did last week with zinc and hydrochloric acid. Now, since we did do this lab last week, I just want to start with a quick review of our experiment. So last week in lab, you guys set up 3 different test tubes. Test tube A, test tube B, and test tube C. And in these test tubes, you each put a piece of zinc. So zinc was that gray metal chunk. And each test tube got the same size piece, roughly, to the best of your abilities. And then you covered that zinc with hydrochloric acid. However, the hydrochloric acids were not all the same. The hydrochloric acid in test tube A had a strength of 0.5 m, m meaning molar. The hydrochloric acid in test tube B had a strength of, oh wait, it wasn't 0.5. That's my mistake. It was 0.1 molar, even less. Test tube B had a strength of 1.0 molar, and test tube C had a strength of 2.0 molar. And then you let those test tubes react. And for the most part, all of our observations were on the same page. In test tube A, we saw relatively little change. In test tube B, we saw some bubbling. And in test tube C, we saw lots of bubbles. And we saw that liquid start to change color. As we were observing it. And we came to the same conclusion. Test tube A had a relatively weak or slow reaction. And test tube C had a relatively fast reaction. Those reactions correlating to the acid strength. A, we have a very small number with a very weak acid. C, we have a larger number, which indicates a relatively stronger strength acid. Okay, so we're on the same page. Test tube A, very slow reaction. Maybe you saw like 2 bubbles. Test tube B, we saw some more bubbles, a visible, clear reaction. Test tube C, we saw a lot of bubbles. And we saw that liquid start to change color as the zinc appeared to kind of dissolve into that solution. And we could correlate that with acid strength. Very, very slow reaction in test tube A, much faster reaction in test tube C, which is why we saw that change in data and observations. Now, none of this should be new. We're just going over this again because I know we did that lab before the weekend and you might have forgotten some of that since we've done it. So we're all on the same page, reviewed the procedure, reviewed the materials, and we've got nice, consistent observations with similar vocabulary. Now, that's page 8 of your packet. Go ahead, turn the page to page 9. And we are going to turn this into a formal CER, similar to how you did it last class with the glow sticks, but this time we're going to be writing the CER over the lab that you did. In the CER, we are still investigating reaction rate. So we're going to do a beginning question of how was reaction rate impacted as, and this time our variable that we were looking at was concentration. So how was reaction rate impacted as concentration changed? Okay, so one sentence, we've got a question word, we've got a question mark. Our next task is going to be to write our claim. So one sentence that answers our beginning question. Now we're going to borrow a lot of vocabulary from the beginning question. So we know our variable of focus. We're focusing on concentration. So we're going to start with as concentration increased, because that's what happened as you went left to right on your test tubes. We started with relatively low concentration, and concentration increased as we progressed. So as concentration increases, or as concentration increased, since we're in the past tense, since we did this lab last week, reaction rate blanks. And I want you to fill that in given your data. And your answer here is either going to be increased or decreased. So based on what you saw, you need to select the correct term. So if you'd like to pause the video and fill that in, you may go ahead and do so. All right, once you're done, we're going to move on to our evidence. In evidence, we're kind of going to break this into two parts. In part one, we are going to write sentences describing the setup and procedure. So we're going to start with the setup. In this lab, 3 test tubes were filled with blank and blank. So I want you to fill in the materials that you used. Remembering we did the drawings. We have these little chunks of metal. Again, what did I say those metals were? And then we have the liquids that were filling them. What was the name of that liquid? And if you need more hints, you can always go back and look through your materials list on page 6 and look through your procedure on page 7. So don't be afraid to use your resources, but find the 2 materials that went in all 3 test tubes. And then I want you to describe the material that changed. The blank, and that's a big blank, had varying, which means changing, concentrations of blank molar, and blank molar. So then, tell me which material had different concentrations, and it should be one of the 2 that you placed up here, and then give me the number values of those concentrations. So that's the setup. Now we want to go ahead and actually describe our observations. Now, we picked increasing as a perspective. So we're going to talk about the increasing test tube and the fast reaction. So we're going to say the test tube with the fastest reaction rate was the test tube with blank molar hydrochloric acid. So find the number value. What was the test tube that had the fastest reaction rate? What was the number value for the molarity of that hydrochloric acid? And then state how you know this was the faster reaction rate. So this test tube was identified as having the faster rate because it blank, blank, blank. And then describe the observations you saw that let you believe that this test tube had the faster rate. And then you want to summarize that, sum it up and relate it back to concentration. This was the tube with the blank concentration. So was it the highest or was it the lowest? Now, before you move on to reasoning, go ahead, pause the video and make sure you've filled in all of the blanks here. But when you're done, we're going to head on over to page 10. Now, in our reasoning section, we are going to use a tool that we've used before. We're going to use a logic train. And our logic train is going to start with the variable that we changed on purpose, which was we increased the concentration. Of HCl. And remember from when we did our zoom-ins and our drawings, when we're increasing concentration, what we're really doing is increasing the number of particles. So the test tube with the higher concentration of hydrochloric acid had a higher number of hydrochloric acid particles. That's where we want to start our reasoning. The test tube with the highest, and then you always want to write the full word once, hydrochloric acid concentration had blank. And then tie this in. You need to talk about number of particles and how those particles are changing. We'll leave another line. Now, what the number of particles really changes is the number of collisions. Our analogy here was bumper cars. When you have more bumper cars in the arena, you're going to have more hits. So now we're starting at step 2 of our logic train and tying it to step 3. As the number of particles increased, blank, blank, blank. Tie that to number of collisions. and then keep following your train. Last class we learned the more collisions we have, the faster the reaction goes. So, starting at step 3, a higher number of collisions. Meant the blank, 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 and then tie it back in. What does that mean for reaction rate? So we've hit on all of our steps, but we want to make sure we summarize and bring this all back to the bigger picture. The final part of our reasoning, some people put this first, some people put this last, but we want to tie back in our claim to make sure we're connecting everything back to what we are claiming we learned in the lab. And our claim had, as concentration increased, reaction rate blanked, and you should have filled in that blank by now. So we're going to bring that back. This supports my claim that stated as concentration increased, reaction rate blanks. Go ahead and fill that in as well. So you by now should have lots of your packet filled out. So just to review, oops, turn the lights back on. We're in the Unit 8 packet. We did the collision theory notes on page 2 and the glow stick demo notes on page 3 in our video lesson on Friday. On Friday, you all should have turned that video lesson into a CER, just like you wrote up today. So that takes care of pages 1 through 5. We did pages 6 and 7 last week together, so you should have the lab filled out as well as the lab procedure with some good observations. We did a quick review of our observations on page 8. And then as we go to page 9 and 10, you should have a fully filled in CER. So if you are on track at the end of today, you have pages 1 through 10 done in your Unit 8 packet. And you are ready to start task 4 with me on Wednesday.